Welcome to Vidskoof. Today, we're ranking the top 10 worst MCU movies. In this list, we'll be highlighting the Marvel Cinematic Universe films that fell short of expectations and didn't quite measure up to the franchise's best. Which MCU movie do you think was a letdown? Share your thoughts in the comments below. So, the 10th worst MCU movie on our list is Avengers Age of Ultron. Avengers Age of Ultron pushed the overarching MCU narrative forward in a big way, but at the cost of its own identity. Instead of standing as a self-contained story, it often feels like a setup for future films like Captain America: Civil War and Infinity War. Ultron, despite his potential, falls flat as a villain, making the film feel somewhat underwhelming. While the character dynamics and action sequences provide entertainment, the movie struggles with an overstuffed plot, featuring abandoned storylines like Ultron's identity crisis and the Bruce-Natasha romance. It's an enjoyable spectacle, but lacks the strong narrative impact of its predecessor. And the 9th worst MCU movie is Thor. On the surface, Thor is a charming, more intimate introduction to the God of Thunder. However, within the vast scope of the MCU, its smaller scale works against it. Aside from Loki and Darcy Lewis, arguably more than Jane Foster, the supporting cast fails to leave a lasting impression. This sets it apart from other origin films like Iron Man and Captain America: The First Avenger, where the entire ensemble stands out. While Thor undergoes character growth, his more likable traits don't emerge until late in the film. Meanwhile, veteran talents like Anthony Hopkins, Idris Elba, and Rene Russo are underutilized, with limited screen time that doesn't do them justice. Though Thor boasts a stirring soundtrack and striking visuals, it ultimately feels like a minor entry in the ever-expanding MCU. And the 8th worst movie is Black Widow. Black Widow tells the right story, but arrives at the wrong time. Coming after Natasha Romanoff's death in Avengers Endgame, the film's plot feels largely inconsequential. With a forgettable villain in Dreykov and a predictable reveal of Taskmaster's identity, the stakes never truly feel high. While Florence Pugh's Yelena Belova is a standout, her role in Disney Plus's Hawkeye ultimately carries more narrative weight than her debut here. The film also suffers from moments of distractingly poor CGI, which takes away from the action. Despite strong performances from the cast, Black Widow ends up feeling more like a side story rather than the high-stakes spy thriller it could have been. And on number 7, we have Captain Marvel. After Avengers: Infinity War teased Captain Marvel's arrival, expectations for her solo film were sky high. However, what followed was a safe, formulaic MCU entry that played things too predictably. With yet another Infinity Stone-driven plot, misleading villains, and the usual quippy dialogue, Carol Danvers' origin story feels like a mixed bag. Characters like Ronan the Accuser, Phil Coulson, Mar-Vell, and Min-Erva are given minimal screen time and little room to grow. Perhaps the biggest disappointment is how little the film ultimately impacts the Avengers saga, despite being positioned as a major turning point. Burdened by the weight of previous MCU films, Captain Marvel struggles to carve out an identity of its own. And on number 6, we have Thor: Love and Thunder. Taika Waititi was praised for bringing humor and energy to Thor Ragnarok, but many felt he pushed the comedy too far in Love and Thunder. Instead of a worthy sequel, the film often feels like a parody of Ragnarok, with jokes coming so frequently that they overshadow the story. This undercuts the film's more serious themes, such as Thor's loneliness and Jane Foster's battle with cancer. The constant presence of screaming goats and inconsistent CGI makes it even harder to take emotional moments seriously. Fans were also disappointed that the Guardians of the Galaxy only appear briefly, and Jane's time as Mighty Thor feels too short-lived. Love and Thunder had the potential to explore its characters' struggles with depth, but instead, it treats them as little more than setup for the next joke. And the 5th worst MCU movie on our list is The Incredible Hulk. The Incredible Hulk aimed to improve on 2003's Hulk, but retained a similarly somber tone. The film jumps from one location to another as Bruce Banner stays on the run from General Ross, limiting the screen time of the Hulk himself. Its darker aesthetic and serious atmosphere also make it feel disconnected from the broader MCU. In hindsight, the Green Goliath's best portrayal came later in the Avengers, where his rage was more effectively utilized. While the film maintains tension, it sacrifices the fun factor that a Hulk story needs. Instead of watching Bruce constantly suppress his transformation, audiences would have preferred more of the smashing action the character is known for. And on number 4, we have Eternals. Introducing a new story within an established franchise is always a challenge, especially when it revolves around characters unfamiliar to the average viewer. Eternals relied on the MCU's brand recognition, but ultimately became a rare critical and commercial misfire. The film juggles too many protagonists at once, leaving none with enough development to stand out. Instead of engaging storytelling, much of the runtime is bogged down by exposition, making the movie feel slow and dialogue-heavy. Without a well-known figure to anchor the story, audiences struggle to connect with the characters, and the film never gives them a reason to care. Eternals fails to strike a balance between plot and action, making it a tough watch as it drags for 2 hours before finally picking up momentum. And the third worst MCU movie is Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. The Ant-Man films were known for their heist-style storytelling and light-hearted humor. Who didn't love Luis's hilarious recaps? But Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania strips away much of what made the series unique, leaving behind a generic, formulaic plot. The film suffers from several weak points, including predictable story beats like Kang's inevitable betrayal and Scott's strained relationship with his daughter. Kang, meant to be the next major MCU villain, never fully delivers on his hype. Meanwhile, despite her name in the title, Hope Van Dyne feels largely irrelevant to the story. Quantumania was intended to kick off the multiverse saga in a big way, but it ultimately lacks the depth and impact to make a lasting impression. And the second movie is Iron Man 2. After the underwhelming The Incredible Hulk, fans hoped Iron Man 2 would put the MCU back on track. Instead, it ended up being an even bigger letdown. The film leans heavily on setting up future installments, but these sequel teasers do little to make up for its flaws. Its biggest issue is a forgettable villain who never feels like a real threat. Meanwhile, Tony's struggle with a slow-acting poison dominates the plot, only to be resolved with an easy fix by the end. The movie is full of stop-and-start storytelling, with conflicts, like Tony's tensions with Rhodey and Pepper, being wrapped up too conveniently. While the action and humour still land, weak writing and an ineffective antagonist hold Iron Man 2 back. And the last worst MCU movie on our list is Thor: The Dark World. While it's hard to call any MCU film outright terrible, Thor: The Dark World comes close. The sequel struggles with a dull visual palette and an equally lifeless tone, making its runtime feel sluggish. Its villain lacks wit, emotion, and presence, while Thor himself spends much of the film simply reacting to events rather than driving the story forward. More engaging characters like Loki are sidelined, leaving few standout moments. Though the film expands on the Infinity Stones, its messy execution makes the lore difficult to follow. Even director Alan Taylor was dissatisfied with the final cut, admitting that it didn't reflect his original vision. Which MCU movie do you think is the worst? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this.